Hey everyone, I wanted to do a very quick overview of what I'm doing for my Mudbox texturing. Hopefully it's helpful for you. So you can see I have my Skullbot loaded in, and I started texturing him already. So you can see that if you look closely, you can kind of see the specular map in there. There's a blue color, and I have this extra decal, which I will show you how I have that loaded in. Same thing with the face, and I've gotten a few pieces down here as well. I also have a black rubber material on several of the body parts, all the parts that are kind of bendy and rubbery instead of metal. And just a quick render of what that looks like. This is in Mental Ray 1080, but I turned down the render quality a little bit, so it's not 100% great looking. But you can see what I'm getting here is a painted metal look, where I have kind of scratched off edges where this metal would be rubbing against stuff commonly, and it's a pretty nice and realistic look. Also, just real quick, my lighting setup is just a Mental Ray IBL. Of course, if you're not using Mental Ray, you can use the equivalent of that for whatever renderer you have. And then I just have two directional lights, which are just one is pointing down, kind of in the front of the model, and one is a backlight facing from the back of the model, and that one has its shadows turned off. So if I were to go into shadows here, I don't have ray trace shadows or depth map shadows turned on. Anyway, so the materials that I have on now, so again, I'm using Mental Ray, but this applies to whatever. Obviously, this should probably be named. And I have several images loaded into different channels in here. So if I were to go into my graph editor, or rather the Hypershade editor, you can see that I have several different maps. Here's a specular map going in for the reflection color, the reflectivity, reflection gloss. I also was using it for a bump map, and I have something different for my diffuse. So for my diffuse channel, I actually have a layered texture in here. So this layer is just a color that I just did straight in Maya, and that's the blue color. And then this, I have a file node, and if you look, I have the blend mode of this changed to add. And what this file is just the skull logo, which is just a JPEG, and it match. I did this in Mudbox, and that's why it's at a weird angle, because it's fitting on the UVs. But this is just a black and white JPEG, which the blend mode of add is what allowed me to have this layered on top of that blue color, in addition to all of the specular stuff. So, and the specular maps I did in Mudbox as well. This is the one for the chest, so you can see the brighter areas are where the most specular will happen, and then the dark areas are where there's less specular. And I made the skull area the least specular, just because I figured that would be kind of like spray painted on or something, so it's not going to be very specular. Whereas the outlines of the edge of his body are worn down, and so the paint gets rubbed off, and that's why that's more specular. And again, those are just plugged in for various these three channels here under reflection. And I'm going to make a new one real quick during this video, just so that you guys can see what my process is for bringing that into Mudbox. So I'll pick another part. Not all of these parts are going to be blue per se. Some of them are going to be just like a regular blackish, grayish metal color. But let's say that I'm going to do, I don't know, maybe this piece, this little guy here. Now I am slightly concerned that there isn't enough edge loops on this going this way, because I don't want my texture to stretch too much when I smooth it. So I may revisit that one later. I think I'll just do a very simple piece. So maybe I'll go with this one right here. And of course that one kind of has the same problem. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to actually unbind this skin. So if you see here, this is skinned currently to the elbow joint. And I'm going to temporarily unbind that skin just so that I can not have to worry about that on my model. The other reason is that I'm going to look at the UVs real quick, and UVing typically adds history items to your mesh, and you want to be able to delete the history before you skin it again. So this is just automatic UVs. It doesn't matter as much when you're in Mudbox because it can paint over the seams. So even if your UVs are kind of scattered, you will still be able to get good results. Now the thing here is that I want to use the same texture when I make this for both pieces. So I want to use the same texture map for this as I do for this, because that'll save Maya some memory and also save me some time, so I don't have to make two separate textures. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to straight up oopsies. I'm going to straight up just pretty much just delete this piece. I'll have to rename it. But I'm going to delete that. And I'm going to real quick on this guy redo the automatic mapping. I might do a layout function on this just to see if I can get them any better organized. So I'm just going to lay this out. One thing about the layout that's good to know is, let me go back to that real quick. One thing that's good about layout is if you check the shell and tile padding, you can make it have a certain amount of pixels between each shell and as well as away from the edge. So if you want to paint, if you want to make sure your textures don't like overlap each other at all, then you can have this padding. Anyway, so in order to get the UVs here exactly the same, I'm just going to actually duplicate this object. And I'm going to do that. I'm going to hit D to edit the pivot point, put the pivot point at 0 in X, center of my scene, duplicate my object, Control D, and then change the duplicate to -1 in X scale. And assuming that my robot's perfectly symmetrical, which I'm under the impression that it is, unless I'm mistaken, that is going to snap directly into the correct position. Kind of a little cheat. I'm going to quick rename this to be appropriate. So it's R, and I can take away that 1. And I'm also going to freeze transformations there. And now both of these have the exact same UVs. So if I click on both of them at the same time, you can't tell. Now this one is technically backwards. That's why it looks red when you turn on your shaded UV display. But that doesn't mean you can't still put a texture on it. And so even though that this is telling you that it's backwards, we're just going to ignore that because we are in control of Maya and we decide when to care about that sort of stuff. So one last thing, I'm just going to grab this one, and I do have some history on there, and I'm going to delete the history, and this one shouldn't have history because when you duplicate things, it doesn't duplicate the history at all. So we don't have to worry about that. Anyway, time to go into Mudbox. So I'm going to save my scene just in case, and I'm going to grab this piece. I only need to bring one of these into Mudbox, not both. And I might also just real quick center that pivot. And I'm going to say File. Now, I could just say Send to Mudbox and send as new scene. This is a good option if you can get it to work. It sometimes, depending on the licensing or whatever computer you're on, it doesn't always work So in lieu of that, I am going to, just for safety's sake, export my selection. Now this could be exported as an FBX. My Mudbox likes FBXs, so you could use one of those. You could also export it as an OBJ. Those are also good. Those are just purely model files, so those can't contain any animation or other things. So I think I'm just going to go with an FBX. There's no real reason for right now why we'd have to choose one or the other. And I'm going to name this something, glove back or something like that, whatever it's called in Maya preferably. And I don't have to really worry about any of this stuff over here, so I'm just going to export that to my scene, my project. It says this scene contains constraints. I don't really care about that. So now that I have that, I can go into Mudbox, and I'm just going to say File, Import, and I'm going to bring that thing that I just saved out into my scene. So we're really just painting the maps in here. We don't really care about the material or anything like that, because that's going to be all done in Maya anyway. So this is Mudbox's version of Lambert 1 that it's showing us. I could say assign new material, Mudbox material, and I could just leave it this color. I could change the diffuse color. I could maybe make it that blue, but actually maybe I will. I don't know. I'm not sure what the exact values of that, but I'll just make it blue. And that's all I really care about, because I'm just going to get started right away as soon as I bring something in here and create a paint layer. I have mine at a pretty high size. It's better to make them a high resolution and then dumb it down later in Photoshop. But I am going to change this to the specular channel. Of course, you could paint it as diffuse and then move that map to the specular later, but for now, I'm just going to do that, and I'll just call this, scratches or whatever, because you can have as many layers as you want. So the next thing you have to decide is really just, what do I want to paint on here? I might reset my tool, and I do want this to be white, probably. In most cases, so you could always change the opacity or whatever later. So we're kind of making this as a very general, map that we can edit later. So depending on your lighting, this could be harder or easier to see. So you can see I'm painting white, which is painting a high specular on here. Now this is boring because this is a very soft and non-detailed specular highlight. So I'm going to want to do one of two things with my brushes. I'm going to either want to turn on a stamp so that my brush itself becomes a different pattern, such as that. Or I can use any of these, really. Just something that's more interesting. And of course, you don't have to limit yourself to just using these Mudbox presets. You can make your own or download other types of maps to load in here. And as long as they're black and white, then they will work fine. And the other thing you could try is, instead of a stamp, you could try a stencil, which, as you should all know by now, just kind of paints through an image as if it's an actual stencil that you might use to do spray painting in real life. Apparently I just undid too many times because my paint layer just disappeared. Now, again, like I said, you may want to consider changing your lighting presets in here to get a little bit of different looks. It might make it easier to see what you're painting. Some of these are a little wacky. I don't really understand how they decided on all these. But that does not really look like default to me, but Sure. So, like I was saying, in this case, it could be easier to make this actually a diffuse layer instead. That way, when we paint, we can see it just as a white color as opposed to a actual specular hit. And then later, we can convert it to being in the specular channel. All right, I'm getting a little lost here. I don't have too many things going on. So first of all, I really don't want that lighting. In fact, I'd like to go back to the original lighting from my scene, although I'm not entirely sure how to do that. They kind of took it away from me and I can't find it. I think I'll just leave this lighting for now. Anyway, so I know that I want my edges of my metal to kind of be a worn off look. I might randomize my stamp for this. And I don't want this to be too extravagant. I want it to be fairly constrained. So I'm going to just kind of do a little bit of painting around the edge. And by the way, this is just for my robot in particular. So, you know, if your robot isn't super beat up, your texturing may not be this extreme, or at least not in this capacity. You know, you might have other features. I'm not really doing any rust or anything on mine, but I could go back and do that. For now, I'm just kind of sticking with the worn down edges appearance. So that I got just from doing this randomized stamp. Now I might make another layer for the next thing. So maybe on top of having the edges be worn down, I could use a stamp like this, or maybe like this, and paint. Now, oops, that's what's weird about this. All of these tools have their own settings, so it's not always going to carry over. So here I can paint some grunginess onto here. Obviously there's some issues with this, like the edge of the image just being cutting off, but if I were to go to my stencil, I could say use tiles, and then I could make that tileable, which is nice. Not every image is tileable in terms of how it looks. Some of them you wouldn't look good if they were tiled, but technically you can force any image to become tiled. And I don't really have to worry about the inside of this because that's not going to be visible when I'm the way that it's placed on the model. So I don't have to worry about really getting that to look correct. But I have this now. I can change my blend mode to make it so that this looks different. The other thing, of course, I could do is just rearrange the order of these so that to get a different effect depending on what I want. So this would be my specular map if this is all I wanted to do for that. One thing to note is that I'm going to make another layer here real quick. One thing to note is that you don't have to use the projection brush to use a stencil, so you could use the paint brush for a stencil as well, and that gives you slightly different results. So you can play around with the differences between using the paint brush and a stencil versus using the projection brush as a stencil. And I can make a little bit more of a scratchy look here on some of the pieces. Maybe I'll go from a slightly different angle to give it some variety. Remember, our main goal with our textures is to make it look real, and real stuff is very random a lot of the times. So, you know, it's not always going to be super obvious what how to make your textures or what exactly to make parts of them look like or stuff like that. I don't really like that. I'm going to leave it like that. Now I can pretty much be ready to export this. I may want to move a all of these to the specular channel just to see what they'll look like as a specular map rather than a diffuse map. Because as long as they're black and white, you know, it can be in pretty much any channel. I'm going to put this one at the very top. And so, you know, that's looking pretty good. And even if I want to change part of the, you know, how intense this is, I can do that later. But for now, my preferred method of getting this out of here is going to be just grabbing this, clicking one of these and saying export channel to PSD, Photoshop document. This is the glove back specular. Save that. And momentarily, we should see Photoshop come open. I already had it open, by the way. I just that's why it loaded so fast. And this background color is slightly different just because of how that lighting preset, but I don't really care about that. So if you wanted to, if you're really concerned about that, you could make that black. And there, that's better. And so really, now I don't ever have to bring this back into Mudbox again. I could just have this Photoshop document and I can edit it from here. So maybe perhaps I don't like this layer being this intense and I want to lower the opacity a little bit of that. That could be something I do. Or change the blend mode of that as well. So now I have all these layers and I can do my Photoshop magic without having to be in Mudbox. When I'm ready to send this out, I can say File, Save As, JPEG, and just do that. Now remember, this is still 4K, which is pretty large, and this is a fairly minor part of the character, so I might just bring this down to 2048 instead, and then I'll resave it out. I should have thought of that first, but I'll resave that out. Yes, I want to overwrite it. I just don't want to save my Photoshop document at that because I won't be able to get it back to its original resolution. So the Photoshop stage for now is fairly short. We're ready now, though, to go back into Maya, and say assign new material. We want that to be a new material. You might want to start with the preset of metal. I've been doing chrome and then just changing it. So I need that blue color back. Give me that blue. And that's for my diffuse. My color, of course, is going to be that JPEG I just made. Or sorry, my reflection color. Not you. That one. So you can already see there. We can see an in viewport preview of that specular map. Hopefully I didn't mess this up because I didn't really pay attention to how much of it I'd be able to see. And I could technically just reuse that image for these two just by finding it in the textures panel in my hypershade. However, I may want to change some of the attributes of those separately. So I am actually going to just bring that in for all three of them. And you'll see why. The reasoning is that if these are all separate, I would technically have the ability to go into here, go into my color balance, and if I thought this was too bright, I could lower the color gain, or if I thought it was too dark, I could lower the color, raise the color offset and make that brighter. But if I did that only on one image, then it would affect all the other instances of that image as well. So maybe I'll lower that a little bit. Now, here's what I was saying when I was worried that this might not have enough edge loops. You can see this is kind of getting stretched out. So if I had made a few more edge loops in here first, that wouldn't really happen. I am still going to see what it looks like, of course. So I skipped the rendering portion of that because it would have taken too long. It took almost 3 minutes, but you can see that I'm getting the desired effect. It's still a bit too extreme. I don't want this much reflection on my map here. So I will probably turn down the color gain of those a bit more. Same thing for probably the reflectivity and maybe the glossiness a little bit as well. And I'm not going to re-render the whole thing, but I'm going to see. Wow, they really don't want to be. They don't really want to get turned down there, but you can get the idea. Anyway, so that's pretty much the process I would use for all of my model. Now, some of the things here, this thing I didn't do in Mudbox. This is just a media material with a rubber preset, and then I put a bump map in and gave it a little bit of a texture. And so, depending on what your robot is, you might have to do varying levels of customization. But no matter what, your robot should definitely not just be a media material or a V-Ray material or whatever, or just slapped on and you change the color and then call it a day, because your final piece is just not going to look that great compared to if you actually put some work into your textures. So I'm going to just keep working on this, and eventually I'll get to my rendering my turntable once I'm done, but you should all make sure to have lighting and stuff set up in your scene before you call your textures done, because unless you see them in the light that you would be actually rendering with, then you're not going to know whether they look good or not. So make sure to have your lights starting to test those out way before you are actually done with your textures. Anyway, that's it for this video, and I'll see you next week.